Relationships between Jakarta persistence concepts in Jakarta persistence. Here you can see the relationships between Jakarta persistence concepts. Um, the In fact, separate API calls are needed to perform many of the operations on entities. This API, here the entity manager, this API is implemented by entity manager and encapsulated almost entirely within a single interface called jakarta.persistent.entityManager. When it is when all is said and done, is it to an entity manager that the real work of persistence is delegated. Until an entity manager is used to actually create, read or write an entity, and entity is nothing more than a regular non-persistent Java object. When an entity manager obtains a reference to an entity, either by having explicitly passed in as an argument to a method call or because it was read from the database, that object is said to be managed by the entity manager. The set of managed entity instances within an entity manager at any given time is called a persistent context. Only one Java instance is with the same persistent identity may exist in the persistent context at any time. For example, if an employee with an persistent identity or ID of 158 exists in the persistent context, then no other employee object with its ID set to 158 may exist within the same persistent context. Entity managers are configured to be able to persist or manage specific types of object, read and write to a given database, and be implemented by a particular persistent provider, or provider for short. It is the provider that supplies the backing implementation engine for the entire Java persistent API from the entity manager through to an implementation of the query classes and SQL generation. All entity managers from the factories of type jakarta.persistence.entity manager factory. The configuration for an entity manager is templated from the entity manager factory that created it, but it is defined separately as a persistent unit. A persistent unit dictate either implicitly or explicitly the same setting, the settings and the entirely classes used by all entity managers obtained from the unique entity manager factory instance bound to the persistent unit. There is therefore a one-to-one correspondence between persistent unit and its concrete entity manager factory instance. Persistent units are named to allow the differentiation of one entity manager factory from another. This gives the application control over which configuration of persistence unit is to be used for operating on a particular factory. This figure shows for each persistent unit there is an entity manager factory, and many entity manager factories can be created from a single entity manager factory. The part that may come as a surprise is that many entity managers can point to the same persistent context. We have talked only about the entity manager and its persistent context, but there may be in fact multiple references to different entity managers, all pointing to the same group of managed entities. This will enable the control flow to traverse container component but continue to access the same persistent context. Here you can see the relationships between Jakarta persistence concepts. Here they note that while some are actual API objects, others are only abstract concepts that help explain how API works. The persistence API object is persistence. Description class used to obtain an entity manager factory. Entity manager factory. API object entity manager factory. Configured factory object used to obtain entity managers. Persistence unit. Named configuration declaring the entity class and the data store info. Entity manager. API object entity manager, and main API object used to perform operations and queries on entities. Persistent context. Set all entity instances managed by specific entity manager. Here you can see relationships between Jakarta persistence concept. Persistence context create entity manager factory. Entity manager factory create entity manager. Entity manager factory configured by persistent unit. Entity manager manages persistent context, and persistent context is connected to persistent unit. Creates a persistent context. One persistent context can have many entity manager factory, and one entity manager factory have one persistent. Entity manager factory have many entity managers, and entity manager can have one entity manager factory. Entity manager factory have one persistent context, and persistent context can have many entity managers. Many entity managers. In persistent context has one persistent unit. Persistent unit can have many persistent context, and entity manager factory has a persistent unit, and persistent unit has entity manager factory. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.